Have you ever been judged by someone who didn't even give you a chance? What happens when the tables turn, and the person who dismissed you becomes the one who has to answer to you? This is the story of Danielle, a woman who faced disrespect but turned it into a powerful moment of change. Stay tuned to find out how she changed the game. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you believe in second chances and real justice. Danielle Morris stood tall in the courtroom, her black suit sharp and her posture steady, but there was no hiding the exhaustion in her eyes. The long hours of preparation, the sleepless nights spent reviewing case files, and the constant battle to be heard weighed heavily on her. Still, she kept her composure, offering a polite nod to the judge as she stood before him. Judge Ronald Clark, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, barely acknowledged her. The moment she stepped up to the podium, he rolled his eyes, a slight but unmistakable gesture of disdain. She hadn't even opened her mouth yet, but the dismissive action stung. His eyes flickered to the case file in front of him, but he didn't bother to look at it in detail. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, under his breath, tapping his fingers impatiently on the desk. Danielle took a deep breath, trying to push past the hurt. She knew how this worked, how certain people in power saw her. She'd been in enough rooms, enough situations to understand the unspoken biases that often arose when she, a black woman, entered the space. But this time she was determined to stand her ground. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and controlled, "I am here to represent my client, Miss Victoria Stevens, who has been unfairly dismissed from her job due to—" But before she could finish, Judge Clark interrupted, waving a hand dismissively. "I'm familiar with the case. You can skip the formalities," he snapped, cutting her off. Danielle's heart sank as she gathered her papers, the weight of his dismissal hitting her hard. She stayed quiet, not letting the pain show on her face. She'd been prepared for this, but the tension in the room was thick, palpable. The others in the courtroom glanced nervously at each other, but no one dared to speak up. Danielle, however, was focused. She gathered her papers with a steady hand, hurt but composed. Danielle's journey had never been easy. Growing up in a tough neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, she learned early that life was a constant uphill battle. Her mother, a hard-working woman who raised Danielle alone, did her best to make sure her daughter didn't feel the weight of their circumstances. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and her mother's relentless drive to ensure Danielle got an education was unwavering. Every day after school, Danielle helped her mother clean office buildings, and on weekends she worked at a local diner to make ends meet. Despite the long hours, she never let the exhaustion take away her dreams. Education was her escape, her way out. It was the key to something bigger, something better. Her high school years were spent buried in books, determined to earn a scholarship to college, and she did. It wasn't easy. She was often one of the few black women in her classes, and at times it felt like the world was against her. Racism and sexism were constant shadows, following her through every stage of her education. Professors doubted her abilities, classmates whispered behind her back, and she often found herself fighting for a seat at the table. But Danielle wasn't the type to back down. She pushed forward, proving her worth with every essay, every exam, every argument. College was followed by law school, where she worked 2 jobs just to pay for tuition and living expenses. Sleep became a luxury she couldn't afford, yet she graduated with honors, her resilience and dedication paying off. She always dreamed of working in the justice system, not just as a lawyer, but as someone who could make real lasting change, especially for women and people of color, who were often ignored or mistreated. After years of hard work, Danielle's dream came true. She worked her way into leadership at the Department of Justice, where she began tackling the very issues she had fought against all her life. A few weeks after the courtroom encounter, Judge Ronald Clark received a call that left him uneasy. He had been invited to a private meeting with someone from the top at the Department of Justice. At first he didn't think much of it. After all, he had attended meetings with high-ranking officials before. But when he entered the sleek conference room that morning, his confident stride faltered. There, sitting at the head of the long polished table, was none other than Danielle Morris. Gone was the modest suit she had worn in court. Now she was dressed in a tailored dark gray suit, her presence commanding and composed. She looked every bit the part of someone in charge, a far cry from the woman he had dismissed just weeks ago. His eyes widened in shock, his stomach dropping as realization hit him like a ton of bricks. She wasn't just any lawyer, she wasn't just someone he could brush off with a dismissive wave. Danielle Morris was now his boss. She was the newly appointed Deputy Director of Judicial Oversight, the very position responsible for overseeing judges like him. Danielle smiled politely as he stood frozen in the doorway, her gaze steady and unwavering. "Good morning, Judge Clark," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an underlying strength. "I'm Danielle Morris. It's a pleasure to finally meet you in person." Clark's face drained of color, he stammered, taken aback, his mind racing as he processed the shocking revelation. How had she risen so fast? How had someone he thought so little of in that courtroom ended up in such a powerful position? He quickly collected himself, but the embarrassment of their earlier encounter lingered, a cold sweat forming on his brow. This was not going to be an easy meeting. Danielle sat at the head of the table, her calm demeanor making the room feel both tense and controlled. Judge Clark took his seat across from her, trying to appear composed, but the unease that settled in his chest was impossible to ignore. He could feel his palms sweating and his throat dry, the weight of their previous interaction in the courtroom pressing heavily on him. She didn't mention it, not once. Not a single word about the way he had dismissed her, the way he had rolled his eyes and cut her off. Danielle wasn't petty, and that was what made this moment even harder for Clark to bear. She had the power to make him feel small, to confront him about his behavior, but she didn't. She was simply better than that. She was professional, poised and above the pettiness that some in power resorted to when faced with their own mistakes. Danielle's voice was steady as she spoke, addressing the room of judges and legal experts who had gathered to hear her vision for the future of the justice system. "There are systemic issues in our courts, issues that go beyond individual cases," she began, her words deliberate and strong. "It's about fairness, it's about equity, it's about making sure that people, regardless of their background, race or gender, are treated with dignity and respect. The time for reform is long overdue." Clark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, unable to avoid the subtle but direct challenge in her words. He could feel his cheeks flush, remembering how he had treated her in that courtroom, how he had dismissed her case without even giving it a fair chance. The shame gnawed at him. How had he allowed himself to be so blind? How had he ever thought he could get away with dismissing someone like her? The other judges in the room were listening intently, their respect for Danielle clear in their focused attention. They knew what it meant to be part of the system, but they also understood that real change required hard conversations and action. Danielle didn't need to prove herself, her credibility spoke for itself. They knew she was here to fix what was broken. Clark's heart sank as he watched her navigate the conversation with such ease and authority. She wasn't angry, she wasn't trying to make him feel small. But in that room it was clear who was in charge, and it wasn't him. That evening Judge Clark found himself lying awake, unable to shake the events of the day. He tossed and turned in bed, his mind replaying the meeting with Danielle over and over again. Her calm, confident demeanor, her words about fairness and reform, they all cut deeper than he cared to admit. But what really haunted him was the memory of the look in her eyes during that courtroom encounter. She had been hurt, but she hadn't shown it. She had been composed, dignified, and far more professional than he deserved. Unable to shake the discomfort, Clark got out of bed. He walked to his desk, sat down and pulled out the file from Danielle's case, the one he had barely glanced at in the courtroom. His fingers trembled slightly as he flipped it open, determined to give it a real look this time. As he read through the details of the case, the facts hit him hard. Danielle was right, the evidence she had presented was solid. Her arguments had been sound. She had fought for her client with a level of skill and intelligence that he had underestimated. He'd dismissed her so easily, and now, reading the case in full, he could see how wrong he had been. The more he read, the more regret gnawed at him. How many other cases had he rushed through without truly listening? How many people had he wronged by making assumptions based on their appearance or their background? Clark closed the file and sat back in his chair, the weight of his past mistakes settling heavily on his shoulders. He had been blind to the very issues Danielle was trying to address, and now he couldn't help but wonder how much harm he had done over the years by failing to see the bigger picture. Weeks later, Judge Clark, his nerves getting the better of him, requested a private meeting with Danielle. He'd spent days thinking about it, knowing that he had to confront his past mistakes if he had any hope of redemption. When he walked into the conference room, he found her sitting calmly at the table, as poised as ever. She looked up with a polite smile, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes that made him feel even smaller. "Miss Morris," he began, his voice faltering as the words tumbled out. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he clasped them together. He had rehearsed this apology 100 times in his head, but now that the moment was here, it felt harder than he had imagined. "I recognize you, from the courtroom." Danielle's eyes, sharp and focused, softened as she looked at him. There was no anger in her gaze, just quiet patience as she waited for him to continue. She didn't interrupt or rush him. She simply sat there, calm and composed, allowing him the space to find the courage to finish what he had started. Clark swallowed hard, trying to steady himself. His throat felt dry, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if the words he had prepared would be enough. "I owe you an apology, not just for how I treated you in court, but for how I've treated others like you throughout my career. I was wrong, and I see that now. I should have listened. I should have given you and your case the respect it deserved." There was no dramatic pause, no big reaction. Danielle's expression remained steady, her eyes never leaving his face. She didn't give him the validation he might have hoped for, no sigh of relief or a sense of forgiveness in her response. Instead, she simply nodded slightly, her gaze steady, waiting for him to process his own words. Her silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that demanded reflection. And then, after a moment that felt longer than it was, Danielle spoke softly but firmly. "Real change starts with accountability, Judge Clark." Her words hung in the air, not to punish, but to remind him of the journey ahead. He had apologized, but that wasn't enough. She was holding him accountable, not with anger but with a quiet strength that made him realize the depth of the responsibility on his shoulders. Clark sat back in his chair, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. There was nothing more to say, no excuse to make. This was just the beginning. But as he left the room, a small shift had begun within him. A shift that would carry him forward, for change had already started, and it had begun with him facing the truth. Clark's heart pounded as he sat across from Danielle, his mind racing, searching for the right words. He had been wrestling with his conscience for weeks, unable to forget the way he had treated her. He knew this moment had been coming, the one where he would have to face the truth and admit his mistakes. Taking a deep breath, he finally spoke, his voice thick with regret. "I want to apologize," he said, his words tentative but sincere. "Not just for how I treated you that day in court, but for how I've treated others like you throughout my career. I was wrong, and I see that now. I should have listened. I should have given you and your case the respect it deserved." As the words hung in the air, he watched Danielle carefully. He hoped for some sort of reaction, maybe a sign that his apology was accepted, that he was making the right move. But Danielle didn't say anything right away. She simply sat there, her expression unreadable. Her calmness didn't give him the validation he might have expected, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him feel both small and oddly relieved. Finally, Danielle spoke. Her voice was steady, but there was power in it. "Real change starts with accountability, Judge Clark." Her words, simple yet profound, resonated deeply with him. They weren't meant to praise him for the apology, but to remind him that true transformation didn't come from a single apology, it came from a continuous commitment to doing better. Clark sat in silence for a moment, feeling the weight of her words. He couldn't deny it, this was only the beginning. The apology was just a small step, but it was a necessary one. As he left the room, he knew that he wasn't done. He had a long road ahead of him, one that required more than just words. It would require consistent actions, humility, and true change. The conversation ended quietly, but something within Clark had shifted. He knew now that he had to do better, not just for Danielle, but for everyone he had ever wronged. The journey ahead would be long, but it had started with this moment and he wasn't going to turn back. Danielle worked tirelessly, not for fame or recognition, but for the cause she believed in so deeply. Every day she woke up with the same quiet determination, knowing that the justice system needed change, and she was going to be a part of making that happen. It wasn't about being loud or flashy, it was about making a real difference. She knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight, but she was patient. She had learned the power of steady progress, one small victory at a time. Her influence grew with each meeting she attended, each new policy she helped shape, and every conversation she had with people in power. Danielle wasn't interested in grand speeches or praise, she wanted results, and slowly but surely those results began to show. More and more, judges started to reflect on their biases. They began questioning their own judgments, the assumptions they'd made over the years, and the flaws in the system they had been part of. Danielle's work wasn't flashy, but it was powerful. Her vision of a more just, inclusive system was gaining momentum. Judge Clark, the same man who had once dismissed her in that courtroom, with nothing but arrogance, now found himself standing beside her, actively supporting the reforms she had been championing. It was almost unrecognizable, the transformation that had taken place within him. He had become one of the most vocal advocates for change, attending meetings, signing petitions, and using his authority to ensure that the reforms Danielle had worked so hard for would come to life. He didn't just see her as someone to look down on anymore, he saw her as a leader, someone who had inspired him to open his eyes and change. Clark could never forget the look in Danielle's eyes that day, the calm but firm way she had stood her ground. It wasn't the humiliation he remembered, nor the way she had made him feel small. What stayed with him was the grace she had shown. Despite everything, despite how he had treated her, she hadn't sought revenge, she hadn't tried to embarrass him, even though she could have. Instead, she had given him a second chance, a chance to see things differently, to become a better version of himself. That was a gift he would never forget, and it was because of her that he worked so hard to make things right. In the end, Clark realized that the person who had once seemed like a threat was now the one who had saved him from his own biases, from his own blind spots. Danielle's quiet strength had not only changed the system, but it had also changed him, and for that, he would always be grateful. The story ended with a simple, powerful reminder: sometimes the people others dismiss are the very ones they will answer to one day. The ones who prove that change is possible, not through anger, but through grace. Thank you so much for watching this story. Danielle's journey is a powerful reminder that real change starts with accountability, and sometimes the people we overlook can be the ones who make the biggest impact. Judge Clark's transformation shows that it's never too late to reflect, learn, and grow. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, comment, and share it with your friends. Your support helps us bring more inspiring and thought-provoking stories to you. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our future content. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about Danielle's approach to change? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks again for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.